So, okay, yeah, the biblical foundation of the magisterium. So let's first start in the Old Testament. This is actually something that whenever we discuss the Catholic magisterium, we tend to start from the New Testament and forget that there is an Old Testament. And so we often just kind of gloss over the biblical roots of the magisterium in the Old Testament. And the problem with that is the New Testament magisterium, the magisterium that we have in the New Covenant today in the Catholic Church, is built on some principles that we see there in the Old Testament. So it's hard to make sense of some things that are said about the magisterium if we don't have that foundation in the Old Testament. So I'm just going to try to walk us through very quickly the teaching authority of the church in the Old Testament. And by the way, that's what magisterium means. Magisterium just means teaching authority. So again, let's talk about the Old Testament by starting with the authority of Moses, even though we could even speak of certain aspects of the magisterium preceding Moses, but I'm trying to just do a summary version here. Let's start with Moses, because he's certainly the most important figure in the Old Covenant when it comes to teaching authority. In fact, Jesus in the New Covenant himself refers to those who sit in the seat of Moses. So this is what he's referring to. If you look at there at Exodus 18:13 through 16 on the screen, it says, on the morrow, Moses sat to judge the people, and that is the people of Israel. And the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone? And all the people stand about you from morning until evening. And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me and I decide between a man and his neighbor. And I make them know the statutes of God and his decisions. Couple of things here. Notice that he is judging between them, so he's acting as a judge, but he's also making known the statutes of God, the laws of God. So there is a teaching authority that is going on here. And in a sense, he's also acting as a mediator, if you will. Loosely, he's acting as a priest, a mediator between God and man whenever he functions in this way. And so once again, Moses serves as a judge over the people of Israel, which did include a teaching and governing role. And again, the teaching role has to do with he's making known to them, what does God require of us? What are his statutes? And he's especially settling that in the context of disputes between the people in Israel. Moses here, again, can be considered as a priest as well as a tribal chief or judge. He also appears as a type of Christ in his legislative and judicial characters, because this is actually something you're going to see in the New Covenant, in the New Testament. It talks about how Jesus is this lawgiver, but he's a greater lawgiver than Moses. Moses is a lawgiver in the Old Covenant, but then you have Jesus who comes and gives a greater law and teaches with a greater authority than Moses. So he's kind of a type, of Jesus here in the Old Covenant. Moses is and remains the special agent of Yahweh. This is coming from a biblical commentary here. God's prophet to his people. From his converse with God, he is to relate to the people the proclamation of divine statutes and decisions and the promulgation of the right way to live. By the way, I can give you references for all this stuff after the show if y'all are interested. Lastly, the plural of Torah here, whenever we looked at that verse there in the Old Testament that we just saw, the word Torah is used there. Sometimes you'll hear that in discussion with Catholics and Jewish apologetics. The term Torah here is used in a judicial sense, and the Pentateuch Torah has the meaning of a moral, legal, and ritual teaching or of law in general. So what does that mean? That just means that it's in that context. The words that are being used indicates that there is a teaching authority taking place here with Moses. And again, that's important because when we talk about the magisterium, we're talking about especially a teaching authority, but we can also speak of a judicial authority, judging between people in disputes, governing, things like that. We're seeing all that here, however, with Moses. Now, it does not stay with just Moses. His father-in-law says, what are you doing, judging all these people by yourself? You're wearing yourself out. So you start to see a sharing of that teaching and governing and judging authority that Moses has. He starts to share that with others. And so here you have Exodus 18:24-26. It says, so Moses gave heed to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens. And they judged the people at all times. Hard cases they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. By the way, if you remember in the New Testament, it talks about the Sanhedrin, that governing body that you have there that even judges Jesus illegally, actually. Well, that group known as the Sanhedrin actually has its roots here in what's taking place with Moses. But again, notice what's going on here. He is sharing his teaching and governing authority with others and doing it in these groups of rulers of thousands, and hundreds, and fifties, and tens. So it's a really high authority, then it gets lower and lower and lower and more localized. And that's kind of a type for how it's going to work in the New Covenant, because we can speak of a universal teaching authority in the Catholic Church, but then we can speak of lower instances, such as maybe a synod of bishops, or groups of bishops in a particular region, or a local council in a particular area, or maybe just a local bishop, and then even the function of a priest and his local congregation. So it's certainly a type of what's going to be fulfilled there in the New Covenant. But once more, notice that you're seeing him passing this authority on to others. It doesn't just die with Moses. He's starting to share it with others, and he is dealing with the most important issues. So he's like the Supreme Court. He's dealing with the biggest issues, and other pettier issues, lower instances of government can deal with. And that way he's not wearing himself out. That's, again, going to be a type of how it's going to function in the New Covenant. So again, Moses is to share the load, so to speak. If y'all are Lord of the Rings fans, you'll remember that from Lord of the Rings, share the load. In the most difficult cases raised by individuals in verse 22, it is Moses who is to give judgment. In the ordinary exercise of civil justice, however, representatives of the people were to handle the cases. And that just makes sense. Why go to all the way to the highest court or highest instance of authority to deal with very petty and small issues that can be dealt with on a local level? This resembles, once again, the structure between the Pope and even the role of bishops that we have in the church today, because we're going to say that the Pope in some ways can act as that universal organ that deals with universal issues. But he doesn't have to be hands-on everything. I mean, you have bishops in the Catholic Church that are supposed to be handling issues in their local territory. So once again, that's a reflection of this. Okay, succession of Moses's authority. Once again, this didn't just die out with Moses. This continued in successors. Look at Deuteronomy 34:9. And Joshua said, or Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did so as the Lord had commanded Moses. A lot of people don't know this, but there was actually in the Old Testament a laying on of hands for a transferal of authority. There's actually been a lot of work that's been done in this area to demonstrate that if you did not have, if you will, a succession of the laying on of hands going back to Moses, then you weren't considered to be as authoritative. No matter how much you knew the Old Testament, no matter how much you knew the law of God, if you did not have that laying on of hands, you were not in the same category as those who did have that authority. So once again, this teaching authority is being passed down through this succession of ordination, of laying on of hands. You also see here, this is, I believe, Deuteronomy 17. My screen's cut off there, but I believe it's Deuteronomy 17. If any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns, this is Moses speaking, which is too difficult for you, Then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God will choose, and coming to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in office in those days, you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. So he's talking about, look, when I'm gone, if you have a dispute, here's what you're supposed to do. And notice that you're going to have a judge who is in office. So clearly, this concept of his teaching and governing authority is going to perpetuate, and it's going to succeed him and endure into others. And this is going to, again, continue through generation to generation until we get to the new covenant. There's also another thing that's said shortly after that in Deuteronomy 18:15 and also verses 18 through 19. It speaks about a prophet like Moses. This is really curious. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren. Him shall you heed. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not give heed to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require of it of him. So he's speaking here of a prophet who is going to be like Moses, who is going to rise up and rule over the people of God. And again, God's words are going to be in his mouth. He's going to speak those things that have been commanded him. So he's obviously going to be in this teaching role. Well, what's interesting is that Moses prophesies of this individual, yet Deuteronomy 34:10 notes that no prophet arose who was like Moses at that time. It even talks about how there has been since Moses no prophet like him. So in other words, we're still anticipating in the Old Testament a fulfillment of this prophet. Now, it's interesting. This is fulfilled in Jesus in the new covenant. But keep that in mind, because once again, he's prophesying of this teaching authority who's going to come after him, who's going to be like him, and really, in a sense, greater than Moses. All right. There's also another concept that we're finding in the Old Testament in 2 Samuel 7:8 through 16 about the house of David. Here's what the scripture says. Now, therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, so it's speaking about King David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make you a great name, like in the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly. From the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. Again, he's speaking to David here. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you. So somebody who's going to come from David, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. So he's speaking about a kingdom that's going to come from David. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his throne, the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. There's this concept of being father and son here. When he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. Before me, your throne shall be established forever. Now, the immediate context, the immediate fulfillment of this is going to be in Solomon. And that's why it speaks about whenever he does iniquity, God's going to reprove him. But you'll notice there has to be a greater fulfillment, because he's talking about his kingdom being established forever. So yes, we might say that there's an immediate fulfillment in Solomon, but how can we say that this kingdom that comes from David is really fulfilled ultimately in Solomon? A kingdom that lasts forever. Obviously, it's not. It's going to be in some other greater successor. Well, there was a very long period of time where actually they didn't even have kings in Israel. What do we do with that? Well, there's a curious phrase. It comes, I believe it's Jeremiah 33. It speaks of a prophecy about how God is going to restore the kingdom of David, and he's going to establish it forever. Well, that has been understood in the new covenant to refer to Jesus. So he's the ultimate fulfillment of this promise here of somebody who comes from David, who is going to rule over the people. Again, you might have an immediate fulfillment in Solomon and some of the people who come after Solomon, but there has to be a greater fulfillment of somebody in whom his kingdom is established forever. And so when you read the book of Daniel, you read Jeremiah, and you read a few other places in the Old Testament, they're strongly indicating that this is going to be filled in the Messiah, the anointed one, which we as Christians would maintain is Jesus. And again, the New Testament backs up this concept because it expressly takes 2 Samuel and applies that to Jesus. So if you already accept Christianity, you accept Luke 132 that says that it applies to Jesus. So again, parallel to the structure of the court of Moses, God also institutes David's throne and promises to establish an everlasting kingdom through his lineage. This is immediately fulfilled in his son Solomon, but ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. It is in this or these magisterial authorities or these authority structures that the Catholic Church finds its roots. So this concept of, again, ruling over the people, judging them, teaching that we see in Moses, that's going to be one important source for the new covenant magisterium as far as its roots, but also this other one, this Davidic throne, this kingdom. Those are going to find their fulfillment in one person. That authority from Moses and that authority from David are actually going to meet in one person. That is Jesus, the Messiah. But note the kingly emphasis to this authority structure, and then compare that to Jesus, who is referred to as a king. All right. Another thing that we see about what's called the royal steward in the book of Isaiah. This is going to be really important when it comes to the papacy. This is from Isaiah 22:20 through 22. It says, "In that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe and will bind your girdle on him and will commit your authority to his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on you his shoulder the keys of the house of David." Notice that, the key of the house of David. "He shall open and none shall shut. He shall shut and none shall open." So pay attention also to this language of opening and shutting. What's going on here? Well, here's what's going on. In the context, you have this kingly authority that comes from David and continues into successor kings through Solomon and others, that really is still around in the day of Isaiah. But the successor to King David, he can't be everywhere. He can't do everything. So he has this royal steward. He has a person who kind of handles some of the day-to-day affairs. And he carries with him the key of the house of David. And he opens and none shall shut. He shall shut, none shall open. This refers to the fact that he had the ability to say, okay, you can have access to the king, you can't. That's important because later on, in the new covenant, there's going to be a greater fulfillment of this royal steward in St. Peter. And in the same way that the royal steward in the old covenant says you have access to God, or I'm sorry, to the king and you don't, then St. Peter, who is this greater royal steward in the new covenant, is going to have the authority to say you have access to God and you don't. And this is actually found in the New Testament itself, where he opens up the door of salvation to the Gentiles. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just keep this in the back of your mind. So again, note a royal steward is placed over the house of David. This will have certain applications in the New Testament when we examine Christ the King and who sits on the throne of David. The key that we see here, a symbol of the major domo's authority to grant or deny admittance to the royal presence, was worn over the shoulder of the royal steward. This will carry certain implications in the New Testament for the new royal steward over Christ's kingdom. By the way, also Dr. Michael Barber, who's a scholar, a Catholic scholar and biblicist, he has some really good arguments where he brings out that there are some priestly features that we find here, especially in verse 21. "I will clothe him with your robe and girdle." The language that's being used here actually has priestly implications, which is interesting because in the old covenant, we tend to see a separation between the priestly office and the kingly office, but here we're actually seeing a connection between the kingly office and the priestly office. That's going to have some implications in the new covenant. I'm going to argue that's a foreshadowing of the new covenant, where we find the kingly office and the priestly office meeting in one person, and that is Jesus. Okay, let's talk about the New Testament, the seed of Moses. Jesus says in Matthew 23, 1-3, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses's seat. That is his teaching authority. Obviously, at the time, a teacher would sit in a seat. That would be a sign that they're teaching. So whenever they would teach, they would actually sit down. Early Christian bishops did this too, by the way. So when he speaks of Moses' seat, they're talking about those who are in Moses' authority. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. That's curious, right? Jesus is actually saying, listen to that authority structure. You know, the people who sit in the seat of Moses, do what they tell you. They have authority over you. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. So in other words, they might be hypocrites. Don't act like them, but they do actually have an authority over you. That has some application to today, because we might say that, you know, there are some bishops who might be an authority over us. They may not always be the best Christians. They may not always practice the faith, but they still have authority over us. And so we have to recognize that just because they may not always be the best shepherd doesn't necessarily mean that they don't actually have authority over us. Do whatever they teach you, but don't necessarily do as they do. But again, Jesus is pointing to this Moses' teaching authority even in his day. So obviously that teaching authority that went from Moses continued all the way to the present of the New Testament. Okay, so Moses' seat, this may be an actual chair. Some argue whether this was figurative or literal. Either way, it's the teaching authority. Like those used in later synagogues are only a symbol of teaching authority. The Pharisees thus preached the Mosaic law with authority, but their failure to practice its weightier matters should not be followed by others. Note the teaching authority in Jesus' day, according to Jesus, goes back to Moses. Thus, the authority established in Moses endured unto Jesus' time. Now, there's something interesting in Matthew 5 where we start to see a shift. Matthew 5, 21-22 says, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. He's quoting Moses. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable. Now, this is interesting, because what he's doing is he's saying he's greater than Moses. He's saying, you've heard from Moses this, but I say to you. In other words, he's saying he has greater authority than Moses. And they picked up on that. They knew exactly that is what he was claiming. Matthew 7, 28-29 says, and when Jesus finished these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. He didn't just teach like the scribes and some of those who sat in the seat of Moses, who all they could do is just repeat Moses and his teachings. They couldn't exceed it. All they could do is just repeat that, because they come in succession from Moses, so they're obviously not going to be greater. But he's saying he's greater than Moses, and he taught with authority, and an authority that is greater than Moses. So now we're starting to see an authority structure that is starting to give way to a greater authority structure, that is in Jesus, because Jesus is fulfilling that Mosaic authority structure. So Jesus spoke not as one who was merely carried the authority of Moses, but as one who has greater authority than Moses. This certainly appears to be the long-awaited prophet like Moses, the new Moses, that prophet that he said is going to come after me, the one who's going to be greater than Moses. That's Jesus. And that, again, has certain implications when it comes to teaching authority, because now you have a teaching authority that is even greater than the old lawgiver. It's a new lawgiver. It's Jesus Christ. So now we have to ask that question. Does that teaching authority established by Jesus just die with Jesus? Is that it? Or does it continue in others? That's what we're going to look at now. Let's also talk briefly about the son of David. Luke 1:32 through 33 speaks of Jesus as the son of David. It says, he will be great and will be called the son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Again, it's speaking about Jesus. So it's saying, you remember those promises that were made to David back in 2 Samuel 7, the promises that he will have a kingdom that lasts forever, that's fulfilled in Jesus. So now we're saying, not only do you have that Mosaic authority structure that's even greater in Jesus, that authority structure that you see in Moses, it's being fulfilled in Jesus, but also the authority structure of David being a king and ruler over the people is also being fulfilled in Jesus, and it's being fulfilled in one person. So Jesus is the son of David who sits on the throne. He is the one in whom the promise of an everlasting throne of David has been fulfilled. So what happens to this authority that we find having its fulfillment in Jesus? Let's talk then about apostolic authority in the New Testament or New Covenant. Jesus in Matthew 10:1 says, it says, then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. We see some kind of authority is now being given from Jesus to the apostles. In this context, it's authority to cast out demons. Luke 10:16 says, whoever listens to you listens to me. This is Jesus speaking to the apostles. He says, whoever listens to you listens to me. Whoever rejects you rejects me. And whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me, which is the Father. So he's now giving also a teaching authority, not just the authority to cast out demons, but also a teaching authority. Listen to me. Whoever rejects you rejects me. Jesus in these passages is giving them temporary missions in Luke 10, in Matthew 10. However, in John 20:21, we see him give a permanent mission to the apostles that repeats this temporary mission that he's giving them there. He says, or it says, Jesus said to them, that is the apostles, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. This is a more permanent authority that he's now giving to the apostles. Let's also talk about Matthew 16:16 through 19, Peter the rock. Here's what it says. Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So he's saying he's establishing a church. It's established on Peter, and the church will not fail. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And then he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Remember that from Isaiah 22? And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. You remember that language of shutting and opening? That's the same language of binding and loosing here. So clearly Jesus is alluding to Isaiah 22 whenever he is establishing this office in St. Peter. Much can actually be said here, but I do want to note that you do even have Protestant experts and scholars, D.A. Carson and was it R.T. France and a handful of others who recognize, yes, Jesus is referring to Peter as the rock, and he's building his church on Peter, not just his confession. Because some will say, well, no, what Jesus is doing is he's building his church on the confession that Jesus is the Messiah. Linguistically, that doesn't make sense. And you also have Protestants who concede that. They'll just say that that authority died with Peter. It didn't continue beyond Peter. That's their response. That's why they don't maintain the Catholic position. But we'll look at whether or not that continues. I will point out, however, you remember in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 22, when we spoke of that royal steward, that was an office that continued in successors. If the royal steward died, it went to a successor royal steward. There was a successor who was appointed to that office. Likewise, if Jesus is making Peter this new royal steward over his kingdom and his house, it's going to find its succession in people beyond Peter. It's not just going to die with Peter in the same way in the Old Testament. It didn't just die with the royal steward. Now, here's some commentary that came from the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible that I actually found very helpful and succinct. So I'm just going to quote it because there's so much going on here in Matthew 16. We could spend hours on it. I just feel like let me just take the summary that they gave and go over it with y'all. I think it's very helpful. It speaks about Matthew 16:19, the keys. It says this is a symbol of teaching authority. And you can see that in Luke 11:52, where the keys are identified with the teaching authority. So what Jesus is doing here in Matthew 16 is clearly establishing a teaching authority in St. Peter. Jesus consecrates Peter as the church's chief teacher, whose office will continue on through successors. Again, in the same way that you have the royal steward, the new royal steward is going to have successors. The plural use of keys may imply a connection with the gates in Matthew 16:18 and mean that Peter's position includes, among other things, the authority to release the righteous souls who are detained in Hades, but destined for heaven. In the Old Testament Davidic Empire, the king appointed a cabinet of ministers for specific tasks in the kingdom. Of these, a prime minister, that's the royal steward, was elevated to a unique status of authority, ranking second only to the king. This government structure was common among kingdoms in the ancient Near East. Jesus here evokes Isaiah 22:15 through 16, where the prime minister's office is handed on to a successor by the symbolic act of handing on the key of the house of David. So they're clearly drawing out that connection between, again, Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. And then it goes on to say in Matthew, Jesus is the new Davidic king who appoints Peter the prime minister over the kingdom of heaven in the church. Again, in the way that the royal steward was second only to the king, now you have King Jesus who is appointing a royal steward who is going to be second to King Jesus, and that is going to be Peter. As in Isaiah 22, Peter's position is designed for him and his successors. The office is meant to endure as long as the kingdom itself. Entrusted with the keys, Peter wields Christ's own royal authority. Whatever you bind and loose, this is familiar language in early Jewish literature. The metaphor carries several connotations. So what is this concept of binding and loosing? There's a whole lot that's involved in it, but it succinctly gives you some examples. It signifies teaching authority. So again, binding and loosing signifies teaching authority, and the ability to render binding decisions. So disciplinary decisions are also included in the exercise of the keys, which is important because today we say the Catholic magisterium not only has authority to teach, but also has authority to promulgate disciplines. It goes on to say it denotes authority to include or exclude members of a religious community in the same way that the royal steward had the authority to include or exclude people from an audience with the king. So too does the new royal steward. He has the authority to include or exclude people from the kingdom of heaven. And this is found in the book of Acts itself. It's also exercised, by the way, in the confessional. The power of the keys of the kingdom is exercised through bishops in their priests. It signals the forgiveness of sins. The verb loose is used this way in Revelation 1:5, and by the early church fathers. Peter is thus invested with Christ's authority as the kingdom's chief teacher and administrator. Through him, heaven governs the church on earth. Again, that's coming from the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. Very, very succinct explanation of Matthew 16. Maybe check out Swan Sona if you want a more thorough treatment. I know his channel, he's done a lot more in Matthew 16. Certainly check that out. But this is just kind of quick crash course on Matthew 16. All right, let's talk about the Apostolic College. And then I'm going to tie all this together here in just a minute. The Apostolic College. In Matthew 18 through 20, it says this. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That same language that we just heard from Matthew 16 to Peter, we're now hearing once more. And this is Jesus speaking to all of the apostles now. So before Matthew 16, when he used this language, he was singling out Peter. Now, whenever he uses this in Matthew 18, he's actually speaking to all of the apostles. Again, truly, I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them. And notice what's missing, the language of keys. That is missing. However, the application of the keys, the concept of binding and loosing is there. So even though he doesn't mention the keys here, it is true he is giving the apostles also the keys. Some Catholics get tripped up on this. They think that only Peter received the keys of the kingdom. We actually have ecumenical council saying, no, all the apostles received the keys of the kingdom. The difference is Peter is singled out. So he receives the keys of the kingdom in a unique way. And then you have the apostles receiving the keys of the kingdom in a more general way. That's going to have some important applications here in just a moment. But Matthew 18:18, whatever you bind on earth and loose. This is also, again, coming from the commentary. Peter was invested with Christ's authority as visible head of the church. A derivative but subordinate authority is given also to the apostles as royal ministers in the kingdom. Jesus's authority in this context is related to church discipline by extension. It's also a sacramental authority to forgive sins. But I will also add, it's more than just discipline. Since they are also receiving implicitly the keys, there also is a teaching authority. That's important. The apostles did have teaching authority, not just Peter. When Christ instituted the 12, he constituted them in the form of a college or permanent assembly. So when we speak of the Apostolic College, we're talking about the apostles in a permanent assembly, at the head of which he placed Peter. And that's evident in the fact that he singles out Peter in Matthew 16, but also other places in the New Testament where Peter comes up first in the list among the apostles. Judas comes up last. In many instances, he singles out Peter as head among the apostles. And that's why you have Orthodox scholars, Eastern Orthodox scholars, and also Protestant scholars that admit, yes, okay, Peter had this kind of priority among the rest of the apostles. Just as by the Lord's institution, St. Peter and the rest of the apostles constitute an apostolic college, so in like fashion, the Roman pontiff, that is Peter's successors, that's the Pope, and the bishops, the successors of the apostles, are related with and united to one another. In other words, what I'm getting at here is that this concept that you have this authority structure there in Peter, who is head, if you will, among the apostolic college, that's going to endure and continue into successors, as I'm going to demonstrate here in a moment. And what that's called is the current Catholic magisterium, the Pope and the College of Bishops. The College of Bishops takes the role of the Apostolic College, and the Pope takes the role of St. Peter. And so in the way that Peter was head of the Apostolic College, so too it is that the Pope is head of the College of Bishops. So let's also briefly talk about apostolic teaching, because again, I want to reiterate the fact that you do have that teaching authority being given to the apostles. John 14:26 says, but the advocate, that is the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything. He's talking about the Holy Spirit is going to be teaching the apostles things whenever he's gone, and remind you of all that I have said to you. So he's going to bring back to their memory all the things that Jesus has said to them, but he's also going to teach them everything. Elsewhere, he says that it will guide them into all truth. John 16:13 says this, when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth. For he will not speak on his own, but will speak whatever he hears, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. So the apostles are going to be guided into all truth, which we certainly maintain as Catholics, because we're going to say that the deposit of faith, that which God has revealed, divine revelation, finds its fulfillment in the apostles. There's no more divine revelation after that. And Protestants are going to agree too. Protestants generally going to say there's no more divine revelation after the apostles. So Catholics and Protestants, I think we're going to all agree this finds its fulfillment in the apostles. Also, Acts 5:21. When they heard this, they entered the temple and at daybreak went on with their teaching. Here we see the apostles actually putting this into practice. They are going around and they're actually teaching. So it's clear that this teaching authority that Jesus is giving to them is starting to see itself into practice in Acts 5. So the apostles were led by the Holy Spirit to hand on what they were taught by Christ. Let's talk about succession of authority in the new covenant, because here's going to be the difference between Catholics and Protestants. Because most Protestants would agree with probably most of what I've said so far as insofar as the apostles have teaching authority, but then they're going to say, but that doesn't endure in any kind of successors, or at least not in any kind of infallible way. The problem with that is the concept that we just saw there of binding and loosing in Matthew 16. whatever you bind in heaven or bind on earth will be bound in heaven. There's a ratification in heaven there. There's a concept of infallibility tied up into that concept of binding and loosing. And so if that teaching authority of binding and loosing that we see there in Matthew 16 and 18 endures in successors, then it's going to have an infallible enduring of that teaching authority. In other words, you would have a magisterium today who is successors to the apostles that has that ability to teach infallibly. But it all hinges on the question, does this go beyond the apostles or does it just die out with the apostles? So one thing to consider is Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Jesus in the Great Commission says to the apostles, and Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So he's speaking here of authority. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So you see a sanctifying aspect here. They're to baptize people, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded. So now you see a teaching authority here. And there's a question of also obedience, so a ruling and governing aspect. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. But succinctly here, we're seeing three things: teaching, sanctifying, and governing all in one spot. And he's giving that to the apostles. But notice what he says here. And I am with you to the end of the age. That is until the second coming. Now, the question is, did the apostles complete the mission of teaching, baptizing, and sanctifying all nations? Obviously not. So this need to baptize, teach, and sanctify all nations still endures to today, right? But the apostles are all dead. So how is it that that authority structure still continues unto this day? Well, he says, I will be with you until the end of the age. It's implied that this need is to endure beyond the apostles, and that Jesus is going to be with us continuing this authority structure beyond the apostles. So we're seeing implicitly a hint that this is going to endure beyond the apostles, but it's only implicit here. But then we see in Acts 1:20, whenever Judas hangs himself, here's what they do. They cast lots and they find a replacement for him, a replacement for the apostles. And here's what it says: for it is written in the book of Psalms, let his homestead become desolate, and let there be no one to live in it. And let another take his position of overseer or bishopric, overseer. So this concept of oversight that the apostles are exercising is going to endure in a successor. And we're seeing that right now in the time of the apostles. That oversight authority that the apostles have, it did not just die with the apostles. In the case of Judas, whenever he hung himself, that office continued in a successor, Matthias. But there's more. Titus 2:1 and 15 says this, but as for you, this is Paul speaking to Titus, as for you, Titus, teach what is consistent. So he's talking about the teaching here that Titus is supposed to do. Teach what is consistent with sound doctrine. Declare all these things. Exhort and reprove with all authority. So he's talking about Titus having a teaching authority and any other kind of authority. With all authority, exhort and reprove with all authority, and teach what is consistent with sound doctrine. Now, Titus wasn't an apostle. Titus was a bishop. Now, we can have the whole discussion on whether there's a distinction between a bishop and a presbyter, but aside from that, he's not an apostle. But the role of teaching and reproving and exhorting is continuing after the apostles into others who are not apostles. That's a bishop. That's going to be an overseer. So we're now starting to see towards the end of the New Testament that there's this transitional phase from the apostles being that teaching authority structure, and it's being now moved into successors. It also says in 2 Timothy 1:6, Paul says this to Timothy, for this reason, I remind you to kindle the gift of God. So we're talking about a gift here that is within you through the laying on of my hands. Now that's curious. He's talking about a gift of God. And in the context, it involves this magisterial authority, this authority structure. And he's saying that he received it through the laying on of hands. Now, you remember in the Old Testament, they received it through ordination, through the laying on of hands. So too it is in the New Covenant. They received this authority structure It's passed on from the apostles to successors. And that's right there from St. Paul. It's a gift of God. We believe the sacrament of ordination is a gift, and it comes through the laying on of hands. All right, let's briefly talk about the Pope and the College of Bishops, and we're going to wrap it up here. So Peter's role, again, as the head of the Apostolic College, was intended to endure beyond his life, as we're seeing a succession here to the authority structure of the apostles, as the function of the royal stewards over David's house was also successive. The teaching and governing role of the Apostolic College was intended to endure beyond the apostles because the need is still there, as is evident by the previous points. Thus, the Apostolic College endures in the College of Bishops, the bishops throughout the world, who serve as the body of the magisterium with the Pope as its head. And this succession comes through, especially the ordination or the laying on of hands. I'll just mention one post-apostolic witness, but there are numerous others that we can go over. So right after the New Testament, you have a bunch of writings from apostolic fathers. These were people who knew the apostles personally, or either knew them personally or knew somebody who did. And they were in authority, they were teaching, and they would testify to this concept that apostolic authority was passed on to successor bishops. So really early on, early 2nd century, you're seeing a very frequent attestation by people who come from the churches established by the apostles, and they're testifying to this authority structure enduring beyond the apostles. So here's just one quote from Clement of Rome in his letter to the Corinthians. This was probably written before 70 AD. Some will give it 90 AD. It's probably before 70 AD. The reason why is 70 AD, the temple fell. The temple that was there in Jerusalem fell but if you look at the letter to the Corinthians, he speaks of the temple as if it's still there, and as if the sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, are still going on. So this was probably written before 70 AD by Clement, who is in Rome. And he's going to be considered one of the earliest popes, according to Catholics. He says this: through countryside and city, the apostles preached, and they appointed their earliest converts, testing them by the Spirit to be the bishops and deacons of future believers. And by the way, some want to say, oh, well, see, he only speaks of bishops and deacons, right? As if he's conflating bishops with priests. And so there's only two offices. There's only priests and deacons. There's not bishops, priests, and deacons. I would say in response to that, if you think that Clement is witnessing to that two office authority structure, as some Protestants maintain, a really good rebuttal to that was actually by Swansona on my channel, Reason and Theology. Just type in Swansona monoepiscopate, and he, I think, put to death the argument that says that Clement is only testifying to this two-tier authority structure. All right, but I digress. So to be the bishops and deacons of future believers, nor was this a novelty, for bishops and deacons had been written about a long time earlier. Our apostles knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be strife for the office of bishop. For this reason, therefore, having received perfect foreknowledge, they appointed those who had already been mentioned, and afterwards added the further provision that if they should die, other approved men should succeed them to their ministry. So he's explicitly talking very, very, very early on about successors to the apostles. This continues in Ignatius. This continues in Hippolytus of Rome. This continues in Irenaeus, Justin Martyr. So there's many other individuals who are in the apostolic era within living memory of the apostles who are testifying to this concept of apostolic succession, a succession through the laying on of hands of an authority structure that goes from the apostles to the bishops of the current day. My recommendation is especially to read Irenaeus's Against the Heresies, Book 3, where he fleshes that out very, very clearly, because he's trying to argue against the Gnostics, who are saying that they have the correct teachings of Jesus. And what he does is he says, I know you guys don't have the correct interpretation of Jesus's words, because our churches that were established by the apostles and our bishops who go back in their ordinations all the way back to the apostles, The teachings that we have received that have been handed down to us through ordination are very different from your teachings. And we can actually trace our roots back to the apostles. You Gnostics can't. So therefore, we have the authentic message of Jesus. You guys don't. He appeals to that concept of apostolic succession. It's really fascinating. All right, so that is the end for my presentation. How did I do on time there?